I never told him about the properties, not once. And the moment he showed me who he really was, I understood exactly why I'd kept my mouth shut. My name is Margaret. I'm 64 years old, and I live in Kelowna, British Columbia, a city of orchards and lake views and retired couples who walk their dogs along the waterfront every single morning like clockwork. I was one of those people. After my husband Gerald passed away 6 years ago, I became one of those women who walks alone, who sits at a table for one at the farmer's market, who learns, slowly and painfully, how to carry her own groceries and her own grief at the same time. Gerald and I had been married for 31 years. We built everything together, our home on Lakeshore Drive, our savings, our routines. When he died of a sudden cardiac event in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, I didn't just lose my husband. I lost the person who knew where we kept the spare keys, who remembered which neighbor had the snowblower we borrowed every February, who made coffee before I was even awake. I lost the architecture of my daily life. The first 2 years were survival. The third year, I started breathing again. By year 4, I had made a decision that surprised even me. I hired a property manager. Gerald and I had purchased 2 rental properties over the years, a duplex in the South Pandasy neighborhood and a small bungalow in Rutland that we'd rented to the same family for 11 years. After Gerald died, I thought about selling. My daughter Sandra encouraged me to. My accountant, a careful woman named Patricia Huang, told me to wait, that the Okanagan market was shifting and patience would reward me. I listened to Patricia. I am glad I did. By the time I met Robert, those 2 properties were generating just over $4,000 a month in net rental income, mortgage-free. The bungalow had been paid off in 2019. The duplex, the year Gerald passed. I also had my own TFSA and RRSP, Gerald's life insurance settlement, and the house on Lakeshore which I owned outright, and which, according to the most recent assessment, was worth just under $800,000. I was not rich the way people in magazines are rich, but I was secure, deeply, quietly, comfortably secure, and I had worked and saved and sacrificed for every single dollar of it. I met Robert at a grief support group at the Kelowna Community Theatre, one of those Wednesday evening sessions that a friend had dragged me to and that I had resisted for months. He was tall, soft-spoken, with gray at his temples, and reading glasses he kept forgetting on top of his head. His wife Carol had passed 18 months before mine. He said he'd come to the group because his daughter had insisted and he hadn't wanted to argue with her. I told him I was there for the same reason. We laughed about that, quietly, in the parking lot afterward, and he asked if I wanted to get a coffee sometime. I said yes. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. 14 months of Saturday morning hikes along the Kettle Valley Rail Trail, of dinners at waterfront wines, of slow, careful conversations about what we each wanted from whatever years we had left. Robert was a retired civil engineer. He had a pension from the provincial government, a modest RRSP, and a townhouse in Glenmore that he'd moved into after selling the family home following Carol's death. He seemed straightforward. He seemed honest. He seemed like a man who had been genuinely wounded by loss and was, like me, just trying to find his footing again. But before I said yes to his proposal, I did something I want every woman reading this to hear clearly. I hired a private investigator, not because I suspected Robert of anything specific, because I had worked too hard and lost too much and rebuilt too carefully to hand my security to anyone, no matter how kind their eyes were or how gently they held my hand during the sad parts of movies. I paid $800 to a licensed investigator in Kelowna, and within 3 weeks, I had a clean report. No debt beyond a small car payment, no hidden marriages, no legal disputes, no red flags. I also hired a family lawyer and had a cohabitation and marriage agreement drafted before we set a date. Robert signed it without complaint. He said he thought it was sensible. That response alone made me trust him more than anything he'd ever said over dinner. What Robert did not know, what I chose not to tell him, not out of deception, but out of hard-won wisdom, was the full picture of what I owned. He knew I had a house. He knew I was comfortable. He did not know about the duplex in South Pandasy. He did not know about the bungalow in Rutland. He did not know the exact number in my accounts, or the rental income, or the insurance settlement that sat quietly in a GIC earning interest I barely touched. I had told my lawyer everything. The marriage agreement protected all of it. Every asset I had brought into the marriage was clearly documented as separate property. My daughter Sandra knew. Patricia, my accountant, knew. But Robert? Robert knew I was a woman who owned her home and paid her own bills and didn't need rescuing. That was enough. That was, as it turned out, exactly the right amount. We married in September, at a small ceremony at the Summerhill Pyramid Winery overlooking Okanagan Lake. 22 guests, Sandra as my witness, Robert's daughter Diane as his. The day was warm and golden the way Septembers in the Okanagan are, that particular light that makes everything look like the last good thing before winter. I wore a cream linen dress I'd bought in Vancouver. I carried dahlias from my own garden. Diane smiled at me all day with her teeth. I noticed that early, the difference between a smile that reaches the eyes and one that stops precisely at the lips. But I told myself I was being uncharitable. Diane was 38, lived in Kamloops, worked in real estate, and had been, by Robert's account, very close to her mother. Of course, losing Carol and then watching her father remarry would be complicated. I extended every grace I had. The first indication that something was wrong came 6 weeks after the wedding. Robert and I had settled into a routine. He'd moved into my house on Lakeshore because it was larger and on the water, and we both agreed it made practical sense. His townhouse in Glenmore was listed for sale. That was when Diane began calling more frequently. At first, it seemed like normal check-ins with her father. Then I noticed the calls were always in the evening, always when I was in the other room, always followed by Robert being quieter than usual at the dinner table. One night in November, I came downstairs for a glass of water and heard him on the phone in the kitchen. He didn't hear me on the stairs. "She's not going to just hand it over, Diane." "That's not, I know. I know, just give it time." I stood very still in the hallway. I went back upstairs. I lay in the dark for a long time thinking about those words. Hand it over. I turned them over like stones. I did not say anything the next morning. Instead, I called Patricia. Patricia told me that everything was protected. The rental properties were held in a trust I had established 2 years after Gerald died, on Patricia's advice. My name only, as trustee and beneficiary. The house was covered by the marriage agreement. My accounts were separate. Unless I willingly transferred anything, signed something, agreed to something, there was nothing anyone could touch. "You're fine, Margaret," she told me. "Just don't sign anything anyone puts in front of you without calling me first." I told her I wouldn't. December arrived. Diane came to stay for the holidays, 10 days in my home, sleeping in the guest room that I had wallpapered myself the previous spring, in a pale green I'd driven to Vancouver specifically to find. She was pleasant at breakfast and quietly barbed at dinner. She made comments about the house that were framed as compliments but carried a different weight underneath. "This place must be worth a fortune now, with the lakefront views," she said one evening, swirling her wine. "Dad mentioned you've owned it for a long time." "Quite a while," I said. "Smart investment." She paused. "It would make sense, wouldn't it, to think about estate planning? Combined assets, that kind of thing." "For both of you. I work with a lot of couples in my real estate practice who go through that process." I smiled at her the same way she smiled at me. "We have a lawyer," I said. "Everything's already in order." She moved on to a different topic. But I felt the shape of what she was doing, the way you feel a bruise before you see it. After Diane went back to Kamloops, Robert changed in ways that were subtle enough that I might have missed them if I hadn't been paying attention. He began asking questions he'd never asked before. How much did I pay in property taxes? Did I use a financial advisor? Had I thought about what would happen to the house if something happened to me? I answered carefully, vaguely. I said everything was looked after. Then, in February, he came home one evening and set a document on the kitchen table. "Diane had her lawyer draft something," he said. He didn't meet my eyes, just a framework. For our combined financial planning, I picked it up. It was 3 pages. What it proposed, dressed in careful legal language, was that my assets be folded into a joint family trust, co-managed. It named Diane as a successor trustee. I read it twice. I set it down. "I'll have my lawyer look at it," I said. "It's just a framework," Robert said. "Just planning." "Of course," I said. "I'll have my lawyer look at it." I called Patricia the next morning. Then I called my family lawyer. Then I called Sandra. Sandra drove down from Vernon the following weekend. She sat at my kitchen table and listened to everything I told her, and then she said very calmly, "Mum, what do you want to do?" I already knew the answer. I think I had known since November, since the dark hallway and those words I wasn't supposed to hear. What happened next took 4 months. I won't pretend it was simple or painless, because it wasn't. There are few things lonelier than realizing that a person you married in good faith was not entirely the person you believed them to be. Whether Robert was a man who had been slowly worked on by his daughter until his own judgment eroded, or whether he had always had one eye on what I might offer, I genuinely don't know. I'm not sure it matters. What matters is what he was willing to do. My lawyer sent a formal response to the proposed trust document, declining and citing the existing marriage agreement. 2 weeks later, Robert came home and told me he wanted to separate. I said I understood. The separation was governed entirely by the marriage agreement he had signed before the wedding, the one he had called sensible. Because every asset I had brought into the marriage was documented as separate property, and because we had not commingled finances in any meaningful way during the 7 months we were together, there was very little to dispute. He left with what he had come with. I kept what I had built. He moved back into the Glenmore townhouse, which had not yet sold. We exchanged the rest of what needed exchanging through our lawyers. I have not spoken to him since. I am telling you this because I want you to understand something that took me a long time to learn, not from this marriage, but from the years of building that came before it. Your security is not selfishness. Protecting what you built is not a failure of love or openness or trust. I loved Robert, or the version of him I was allowed to know. I went into that marriage genuinely, with a full heart and a clear conscience. But I also went in with my eyes open, with good legal advice, with documentation, and with the wisdom to understand that love and prudence are not opposites. The women who told me before the wedding that I was being too cautious, too guarded, too businesslike, I think of them sometimes. I think of what my life would look like right now if I had listened. My duplex in South Pandacy is fully occupied. The family in the Rutland bungalow renewed their lease again in March. The same family, 11 years now, going on 12. My house on Lakeshore still has dahlias in the garden every September, though I tend them alone. Sandra comes on weekends sometimes, and we sit on the back deck with coffee and watch the lake change color as the light shifts. I walk along the waterfront in the mornings. I still see the couples with their dogs. I don't envy them the way I used to. I am 64 years old. I have my health, my home, my income, and my independence. I have a daughter who drove from Vernon the moment I needed her. I have an accountant who told me 6 years ago to be patient, and who was right. I have a lawyer who protected everything I'd worked for. And I have learned more clearly than I ever wanted to that the best thing I ever did for my future was to walk into that marriage with my hands open and my paperwork in order. If you are a woman thinking about remarrying at any age, but especially at an age when you have already spent decades building something, please hear me. Do the background check. Hire the lawyer, draft the agreement. Protect your assets in a structure that doesn't depend on anyone's goodwill. Because goodwill, as it turns out, is not always what it appears to be in September, in the golden Okanagan light, when everything looks like the last beautiful thing before winter. Protect yourself. Not because love isn't real, but because what you've built is real too, and you built it yourself. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more women out there than you'd think, who are sitting at kitchen tables, looking at documents they don't yet understand, wishing someone had told them sooner. Be that person for them. Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and if you've been through something similar, I'd love to know how you found your way through.